The evening sky had turned a deep blue as Officer Wilson drove along Pine Street. The streetlights had just come on, casting long shadows across the road. It was almost the end of his shift, and he was looking forward to going home, kicking off his boots, and catching the last quarter of the basketball game. His radio crackled with the usual chatter, a noise complaint on 7th, a fender bender on Main. Nothing out of the ordinary. Wilson sipped his now-cold coffee as he turned onto Oakwood Drive. That's when he noticed the blue sedan ahead of him. The car drifted slightly over the center line before correcting itself, then moved too close to the shoulder. The right taillight was out too, a clear violation. He'd seen this pattern hundreds of times before. Probably someone texting, or maybe they'd had a few drinks. Either way, it was his job to check it out. He set down his coffee, flipped on his lights, and picked up his radio. Dispatch, I'm initiating a traffic stop on a blue Toyota Camry, license plate Charlie Hotel 7493, on Oakwood near the intersection with Birch. The radio crackled back with confirmation as the sedan slowly pulled to the side of the road, tires crunching on gravel. Wilson had done this so many times he could do it in his sleep. 19 years on the force teaches you the routine. Check your surroundings. Approach from slightly behind the driver's side. Keep your right hand free near your hip. Standard procedure. As he stepped out of his patrol car, he noticed the sedan was still running but not perfectly straight, like the driver had been in a hurry to pull over. A bit unusual, but nothing alarming. He clicked on his flashlight, even though the streetlight overhead gave decent visibility. Better safe than sorry. That's what kept cops alive. Evening, he practiced under his breath, reminding himself to stay professional but friendly. I'm Officer Wilson with the County Police Department. Do you know why I pulled you over today? The walk to the driver's side window was about 15 steps. He took it slow, scanning the vehicle. No sudden movements inside. Just one silhouette he could make out, the driver. The windows were slightly tinted, making it hard to see clearly inside. He was about 5 steps away when he heard it, a baby crying. Not just fussing, but the full-throated wail of an infant in distress. Wilson's pace quickened slightly. 3 steps away, he noticed the driver's silhouette seemed unusually small. 2 steps away, he saw small hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. 1 step away, and the full picture came into view as he shined his flashlight through the driver's window. Wilson felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. Time seemed to slow down. Behind the wheel sat a boy, a young black boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. The child was straining forward in the seat, chin up, trying desperately to see over the dashboard. His eyes were wide with fear, reflecting the flashing blue and red lights. Those hands gripping the wheel so properly at 10 and 2 were trembling badly. And from the back seat, the crying grew louder. A baby strapped in a car seat, face red and streaked with tears, tiny fists balled up in distress. Wilson's mind raced through a dozen possibilities, none of them good. Kidnapping? Runaways? Some kind of emergency. The boy looked terrified, but not guilty. There was something else in his expression. Determination? Desperation? Wilson's hand moved away from his hip as his training gave way to human instinct. This wasn't a drunk driver or a speeder. This was a child, and something was very wrong. Son, he said, working to keep his voice steady and calm despite his racing heart. I need you to turn off the engine for me, okay? The boy nodded quickly, his breathing fast and shallow. His small hand reached for the keys, missing twice before managing to turn the car off. The engine died, leaving only the sound of the baby's continued wails and the boy's shaky breathing. Wilson leaned down slightly, making eye contact with the child. I'm not here to hurt you, but I need you to tell me what's going on. Why are you driving this car, and whose baby is that? The boy looked up at Officer Wilson, his eyes glistening with tears he was trying hard not to shed. His bottom lip quivered, but there was something in the way he sat up straight that told Wilson this wasn't a kid who was up to no good. This was a child facing something big, something scary. It's my little sister, the boy finally said, his voice cracking. And my mom's in the hospital. He looked back at the wailing infant, worry etched across his young face. She's burning up with fever, and I didn't know what else to do. Wilson bent down further, getting to eye level with the boy. The car's interior smelled like baby powder and the sweet sour scent of apple juice. A child's backpack sat on the passenger floor, covered in superhero stickers. This was a family car, not a stolen one. "How old are you, son?" Wilson asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be anywhere near 16. 11, the boy answered, then quickly added, "But I'll be 12 next month." As if that extra month would somehow make everything okay. "I know I'm not supposed to drive, sir. My dad taught me how in case of emergency, and this is an emergency." His voice rose slightly at the end, defensive but also pleading for understanding. The baby's cries grew more insistent. Wilson shined his flashlight gently toward the back seat. The infant couldn't have been more than 6 months old, strapped into a car seat that looked properly installed. At least someone had made sure of that. Her tiny face was flushed, eyes squeezed shut as she screamed, small fists waving in distress. "She's been crying for hours," the boy explained. "Dad's at work at the factory, and they don't let him have his phone on the floor. Mom started bleeding real bad and had to call an ambulance for herself. The neighbor who was supposed to come watch us never showed up." He took a shaky breath. "My sister's getting worse. I tried giving her medicine, but she keeps crying and crying." Wilson radioed dispatch. "Can you confirm if there was an ambulance call to 248 Pine Street earlier tonight?" The radio crackled. "Affirmative, Officer Wilson. Ambulance dispatched at 8:17 p.m. for a pregnant woman with complications. Patient was transported to Memorial Hospital." The picture was becoming clearer now. Wilson looked at the boy, who was watching him intently, trying to read his face for signs of what would happen next. "What's your name, son?" Wilson asked. "Thomas," the boy replied, then nodded toward the backseat. "And that's my sister. She's got a fever of 103. I used the thermometer like Mom showed me." Wilson's mind raced through protocols and procedures. The laws were clear. An 11-year-old had no business behind the wheel of a car. But life rarely fit neatly into the boxes of law and regulation. He thought about his own kids at home, about what they might do in a similar situation. "Stay put," Wilson said, his decision already forming. He walked to the back door and opened it carefully. The baby's cries hit him at full volume now. He gently placed his hand on her forehead. She was burning up. "Thomas, has your sister had any medicine for the fever?" Wilson asked, keeping his voice calm despite his growing concern. "Mom gave her some before she got sick, but that was hours ago." Thomas twisted in his seat to look back. "Is she gonna be okay?" The genuine fear in the boy's voice made Wilson's heart ache. This kid wasn't being reckless. He was being brave in the only way he knew how. "I'm going to help you," Wilson said firmly. "Both of you." He reached for his radio again. "Dispatch, I'm going to need a backup unit at my location." Thomas's face fell. "Am I going to jail?" Wilson shook his head. "No, son. You're going to the hospital, to your mom. And I'm going to make sure you get there safely." He smiled slightly. "But I'll be the one driving, okay?" For the first time since Wilson had approached the car, Thomas's shoulders relaxed slightly. A single tear finally escaped, rolling down his cheek as he nodded. "Thank you, sir," he whispered, his voice small but sincere. Wilson nodded back. "You did what you thought was right to protect your sister." That took courage. "Now let me help you the rest of the way." Officer Wilson's partner arrived within minutes, headlights cutting through the darkness as the patrol car pulled up behind them. Wilson had already moved Thomas to the passenger seat and was checking on the baby, whose cries had become worryingly softer, more like whimpers. "What have we got?" Officer Rivera asked as she approached, flashlight in hand. "Medical emergency," Wilson replied, nodding toward the baby. "Little one's burning up with fever. Mom's already at Memorial with pregnancy complications. Dad's unreachable at the night shift. This young man was trying to get his sister to the hospital." He gave Thomas a gentle pat on the shoulder. Rivera's eyebrows shot up as she looked at the boy, then back to Wilson. Her expression said everything: surprise, concern, and understanding all at once. "I'll follow you in the patrol car," she said without hesitation. "You take these two in their vehicle." As they drove toward the hospital, Thomas sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally turning to check on his sister. The streetlights washed over his face in rhythmic pulses, highlighting the worry lines that no 11-year-old should have. "You said your dad taught you to drive?" Wilson asked, trying to keep the boy talking. Thomas nodded. In the empty parking lot behind the grocery store on Sundays. He said I should know how, just in case. A small, sad smile crossed his face. Guess he was right. Your dad sounds like a smart man, thinking ahead like that. He works really hard, Thomas said, his voice filling with pride. 2 jobs since the baby came. Mom says he's the hardest working man in the whole state. He looked down at his hands. That's why they can't reach him tonight. No phones allowed on the factory floor. Wilson nodded, thinking about how many families lived on this knife's edge, one emergency away from impossible choices. What about you? Wilson asked. What grade are you in? 6th. I'm good at math, Thomas answered, then added quietly, my teacher says I could skip a grade if I wanted, but then who would walk my friends home after school? Wilson glanced at the boy, seeing layers of responsibility that went far beyond his years. You look out for people, don't you? Thomas shrugged as if it was the most natural thing in the world. That's what you're supposed to do, right? Look out for each other. From the back seat, the baby let out another whimper, weaker than before. Thomas twisted around immediately. She's getting worse, he said, panic edging into his voice. Please hurry. Wilson pressed a little harder on the gas pedal, navigating the quiet streets with urgency but care. The hospital was just 2 miles ahead now. She's gonna be okay, right? Thomas asked, his voice small. Wilson wanted to promise, to reassure this brave kid that everything would work out fine. But in his 19 years as an officer, he'd learned that hollow promises did more harm than good. We're getting her to people who can help her, he said instead. You did the right thing getting her medical attention. That's what matters right now. Thomas seemed to sense the careful honesty in Wilson's words. He nodded slowly, turning back to watch the road ahead. I was so scared, he admitted after a moment. When I saw your lights behind me, I thought, his voice trailed off. You thought you were in trouble, Wilson finished for him. Thomas nodded. Big trouble. Wilson thought about how this scene might have played out differently, with a different officer, or if he hadn't taken those extra moments to understand what was happening. The thought made his stomach tighten. Sometimes, Wilson said carefully, the rules don't fit every situation. Sometimes we have to look deeper to see what's really going on. The hospital came into view, its emergency room lights blazing against the night sky. Thomas straightened in his seat, eyes fixed on the building where his mother was. We're here, Wilson said, pulling into the emergency entrance. Officer Rivera pulled in right behind them, already on her radio, alerting the ER staff about the baby's condition. As Wilson helped unbuckle the infant from her car seat, he noticed Thomas standing perfectly still, staring up at the hospital building. What is it, son? Wilson asked. Thomas turned to him, eyes wide with a new fear. What if my mom is really sick? What if he couldn't finish the sentence. Wilson placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. One step at a time, he said gently. First, we get your sister help. Then we find your mom. I'll be right beside you the whole way. Thomas took a deep breath and nodded, squaring his small shoulders as they walked toward the sliding doors of the emergency room. The emergency room was a buzz of activity even at this late hour. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making everyone look pale and tired. Officer Wilson carried the feverish baby while Thomas stayed close to his side, almost hiding in his shadow. Officer Rivera had gone to park the family's car properly, promising to join them soon. My baby. A nurse with kind eyes and quick hands rushed forward as soon as she saw the infant in Wilson's arms. How long has she been like this? Her brother says she's had a fever for hours, Wilson explained. Temperature around 103. The nurse nodded, already checking the baby's eyes and feeling her forehead. Bring her this way, quickly. Thomas grabbed Wilson's sleeve. Don't leave her alone, he whispered, his eyes wide with worry. I won't, Wilson promised. Stay right with me. They'd followed the nurse to a small examination room where a doctor was waiting. The baby whimpered weakly as they laid her on the examination table. You're her father? The doctor asked Wilson. No, sir. I'm Officer Wilson. This is her brother, Thomas. Their mother was brought in earlier tonight. Pregnancy complications. The doctor's eyes softened with understanding. He turned to Thomas. Can you tell me your baby sister's name and age? She's Lily, Thomas said, standing as tall as he could. She's 6 months and 2 weeks old. She had her checkup last month, and the doctor said she was growing good. The doctor nodded encouragingly. Has Lily had any medicine today? Mom gave her the fever medicine before the ambulance came. The pink one. But that was a long time ago, like 4 hours or more. The doctor and nurse moved efficiently, checking Lily's temperature, listening to her chest, looking in her ears. Thomas watched every move, his hands fidgeting with the zipper of his jacket. She has an ear infection, the doctor finally said. It's pretty advanced, which explains the high fever. We'll start her on antibiotics right away. Is she gonna be okay? Thomas asked, his voice small but steady. The doctor smiled warmly. Yes, young man. You got her here in time. Ear infections can be very painful and cause high fevers, but they respond well to treatment. Thomas's shoulders dropped with relief. He looked up at Officer Wilson with the ghost of a smile. We made it in time, he whispered. While the nurse stayed with Lily to begin treatment, Wilson put his hand gently on Thomas's shoulder. Now let's find your mom. At the main desk, a tired-looking receptionist typed on her computer. Johnson family. Yes, Mrs. Johnson was admitted a few hours ago. She's on the 3rd floor, maternity ward. She glanced at Thomas. Are you family? This is her son, Wilson explained. I'm sorry, children under 12 aren't allowed in the maternity ward due to infection risks. Thomas's face fell. After everything he'd been through, to be stopped by a hospital rule seemed like the final straw. His eyes filled with tears he'd been fighting all night. Man, Wilson said, leaning in slightly. This young man drove his baby sister to the hospital tonight because there was no one else to help them. I think we can make an exception. The receptionist looked surprised, then impressed. She studied Thomas with new respect. Give me a moment. She picked up her phone and had a brief conversation, then nodded. You can go up. Room 312. Someone will meet you at the elevator. As they rode up in the elevator, Thomas was quiet, staring at the changing floor numbers. Nervous? Wilson asked. Thomas nodded. What if she's mad at me for driving the car? Wilson thought carefully before answering. Your mom might be scared about what could have happened. That comes from love. But you did what you did because you love your sister. Your mom will understand that. The elevator doors opened, and a nurse was waiting for them as promised. Her face was gentle, but her eyes were curious, moving from the uniformed officer to the young boy beside him. Thomas Johnson, your mother has been asking for you. She's been very worried. They followed her down a hallway lined with rooms. Some had the sounds of TV, others quiet conversation. From one came the distant cry of a newborn baby. Outside room 312, Thomas hesitated. For all his bravery driving through the night, facing his mother seemed the most daunting challenge yet. Officer Wilson knelt down to look Thomas in the eye. Remember, you're a hero tonight. You got your sister the help she needed. Thomas took a deep breath. Will you come in with me, just at first? Wilson nodded. Of course I will. Together, they stepped into the room, where a woman lay in a hospital bed, her eyes lighting up at the sight of her son. The hospital room was dim, lit only by a small lamp beside the bed. Thomas's mother looked both exhausted and relieved when she saw her son. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, and an IV tube ran from her arm to a bag hanging beside her bed. Thomas, she cried, reaching out with her free arm. Oh, thank God you're okay. Thomas rushed to her side, suddenly just a child again, not the brave driver of earlier, but a scared little boy who needed his mom. She pulled him close, kissing the top of his head over and over. I'm so worried, she whispered, her voice breaking. When I couldn't reach your father, and the neighbor didn't answer. She looked up, noticing Officer Wilson for the first time. Her body tensed. What happened? Is everything all right? Wilson stepped forward, hat in hand. Your son is quite remarkable, ma'am. He brought your daughter to the hospital when she needed medical attention. The mother's eyes widened with fear. Lily? What's wrong with Lily? She has an ear infection, Thomas explained quickly. The doctor's giving her medicine right now. He said she's gonna be okay because we got her here in time. We? His mother looked between Thomas and the officer, confusion clear on her face. Wilson cleared his throat gently. Ma'am, I found your son driving your car toward the hospital with Lily in the back seat. The color drained from her face. Driving? Thomas, you drove the car. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, his chin trembling slightly. I didn't know what else to do, Mom. Lily kept crying, and she was so hot. I tried calling Dad at work, but they wouldn't put me through. I tried Mrs. Carter next door, but she didn't answer. I even called Uncle Ray, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I had to do something, he continued, the words tumbling out faster now. I remembered how Dad taught me in case of emergency. I was really careful, Mom. I used my turn signals and everything. I went real slow. His mother closed her eyes for a moment, tears sliding down her cheeks. When she opened them again, she looked at Officer Wilson. Are you here to arrest my son? She asked, her arm tightening protectively around Thomas. Wilson shook his head. No, ma'am. I'm here to make sure your family is okay. She looked at him skeptically, years of ingrained caution making her search his face for any sign of deception. It's true, Mom, Thomas said. Officer Wilson drove us here himself in our car, and his partner followed in the police car. He made sure the doctors took care of Lily right away. The door opened and a nurse wheeled in a small bassinet. Inside was Lily, still flushed but sleeping peacefully, a tiny bandage on her arm where they'd given her medicine. Your daughter's fever is already coming down, the nurse explained. The doctor wants to keep her overnight for observation, but she's responding well to the antibiotics. Thomas's mother reached out toward the bassinet, and the nurse wheeled it closer so she could touch her baby's hand. Thank you, she whispered, looking up at the nurse, then at Wilson. Thank you for helping my children. Don't thank me, Wilson said gently. Your son is the real hero tonight. He turned to Thomas with genuine respect in his eyes. I've been a police officer for 19 years, and I've never met anyone braver than you. Thomas stood a little taller, his chest swelling with pride. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Officer Rivera entered, followed by a tall man in work clothes, still wearing his factory ID badge. His face was creased with worry. Dad, Thomas cried out. The man rushed into the room, looking from his wife to his children in confusion and relief. What happened? The police came to my job. His voice trailed off as he tried to make sense of the scene before him. It's a long story, Thomas's mother said, managing a tired smile. But everyone's okay now. As Thomas ran to hug his father, Wilson stepped back, watching the family reunite. In all his years wearing the badge, few moments had felt as right as this one, not about enforcing laws, but about protecting a family when they needed it most. Officer Rivera touched his arm. Ready to head out. Our shift ended an hour ago. Wilson looked at the family one last time. Thomas caught his eye and gave him a small, grateful smile. Not quite yet, Wilson replied quietly. There's something I need to do first. The hospital cafeteria was nearly empty at this late hour. Officer Wilson sat across from Thomas's father, 2 untouched cups of coffee between them. The father's work-roughened hands fidgeted with a sugar packet, tearing the edges nervously. I should have answered my phone, he said for the 3rd time, shaking his head. I tell them that I need to be reachable for my family. Factory rules can be strict, Wilson acknowledged. He'd grown up in a factory town himself, knew how the system worked. I have 3 missed calls from Thomas, the father continued, his voice thick with emotion. My 11-year-old son needed me, and I wasn't there. Wilson leaned forward. You've taught him well. He knew exactly what to do in an emergency. A small, sad smile crossed the father's face. Those Sunday driving lessons, my wife thought I was crazy. He looked up at Wilson, eyes serious. I never thought he'd actually need to use them. But he did, Wilson said, and he handled it perfectly. The father took a deep breath. Officer, I need to ask, what happens now? With Thomas driving without a license. This was the moment Wilson had been leading up to. He set down his coffee cup deliberately. Technically, there are several violations, he began, watching the father's face fall. But law enforcement isn't just about following the rulebook. Wilson pulled out a small notepad and pen. I'm writing this up as an assisted medical transport. No citations, no charges. He scribbled something, then closed the pad. As far as I'm concerned, I responded to a family medical emergency and helped transport a child to the hospital. That's all that goes in my report. The father stared at him, disbelief and gratitude washing over his face. "You'd do that? Why?" Wilson thought about it. In 19 years on the force, he'd seen situations handled by the book that should have been handled by the heart. He'd seen lives derailed by rigid adherence to rules that didn't account for desperate circumstances. "Because your son did the right thing in an impossible situation," Wilson said simply, "and punishing him for that doesn't serve justice or public safety." The father's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't know what else to say, but thank you." "There is something else we need to discuss," Wilson said, his tone gentle but serious. "Your family needs a backup plan for emergencies. What happened tonight can't happen again, not because Thomas did anything wrong, but because he shouldn't have to face that kind of responsibility." The father nodded firmly. "You're right. My brother lives 20 minutes away. I'll give him a key. And I'm going to speak with my supervisor tomorrow about emergency contacts." "There's also a community program the police department runs," Wilson added, pulling a card from his pocket. "It helps families connect with nearby support networks for exactly these kinds of situations." The conversation was interrupted by Officer Rivera, who appeared at the cafeteria doorway. Wilson got a minute. He excused himself and stepped aside with his partner. "Something you should see," Rivera said, handing him her phone. It was a social media post. Someone had recorded Wilson helping Thomas and baby Lily into the hospital. The video already had hundreds of shares and comments, most praising the officer's compassion. "It's going viral," Rivera said. The captain called. "He wants a statement for the morning news." Wilson handed back the phone with a sigh. Public attention was the last thing he wanted. "Tell him I'll call in the morning." When he returned to the table, Thomas's father was standing, ready to head back to his family. "Your son asked me to give you this," the father said, holding out a folded piece of paper, a page torn from the back of a hospital brochure. Wilson unfolded it to find a child's drawing. Simple stick figures showed a police car, a family, and an officer standing protectively beside them. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for believing me." Wilson carefully tucked the drawing into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. "You know," he said quietly as they walked back toward the elevators, "in all the confusion, I never got your son's full name." "Thomas," the father said with pride in his voice. "Thomas Lee Washington. And I hope you'll let me know if there's ever anything my family can do for you." Wilson nodded, thinking about the community program he'd mentioned, about the gaps in the system that had put this family in such a difficult position in the first place. An idea was beginning to take shape in his mind. "Actually," he said, "there might be something we could work on together." 3 months later, Officer Wilson stood at the back of the community center, watching as people filled the rows of folding chairs. A hand-painted banner hung across the front wall. Community Emergency Response Network, Neighbors Helping Neighbors. Thomas spotted him and waved excitedly, weaving through the crowd to reach him. The boy looked different now, more confident, standing taller. "Officer Wilson, Dad said you might not make it because of your shift." Wilson smiled. "I wouldn't miss this for anything. And please, you can call me Mike." Thomas nodded, testing the name out. "Mike." Then he grinned. "Come on, we saved you a seat up front." Wilson followed him to where Thomas's family sat. The mother looked healthy again, baby Lily perched on her lap, chubby and bright-eyed. Beside them sat the father, who stood to shake Wilson's hand firmly. "Good to see you," he said warmly. "We weren't sure if you'd be able to come." "I switched shifts," Wilson admitted. "This is too important to miss." The lights dimmed slightly, and Thomas's father made his way to the front of the room. He cleared his throat nervously before speaking into the microphone. "Thank you all for coming tonight. 3 months ago, my family faced a crisis that could have ended very differently." He looked at his son, then at Wilson. "My 11-year-old son had to make an impossible choice when his baby sister needed medical help and there was no one to turn to." A murmur went through the crowd. Many had heard the story. It had been in all the local papers, had even made the regional news. "That night taught us something important," he continued. "In our community, too many families are just one emergency away from disaster. Working parents, single parents, families without nearby relatives, we all need a safety net." He gestured to the tables at the side of the room, covered with sign-up sheets and information packets. That's why we're launching the Community Emergency Response Network. Neighbors helping neighbors in times of crisis, a phone number to call when you need immediate childcare during an emergency, volunteers who can drive someone to the hospital, people willing to be emergency contacts for latchkey kids. From her seat, Thomas's mother stood up, balancing Lily on her hip. We've already got 30 volunteers signed up, she added. People from churches, community groups, retired folks, all willing to be on call to help families like ours. Wilson watched as heads nodded throughout the audience. This was exactly what he'd envisioned that night in the hospital cafeteria, not just a solution for one family, but a community-wide safety net. After the presentation, people crowded around the tables, signing up to volunteer or adding their names to receive services. The local news crew that had come to cover the event was interviewing Thomas's father. Wilson felt a tug on his sleeve and looked down to see Thomas. "Want to see something?" the boy asked, leading Wilson to a bulletin board near the entrance. Pinned to the board were dozens of drawings from local schoolchildren, pictures of families helping other families, of neighbors coming together. In the center was a framed copy of Thomas's original drawing from the hospital, the one he'd given Wilson that night. "My teacher had our whole class make pictures about community helpers," Thomas explained. "Then other classes did it too." "This is amazing," Wilson said, genuinely moved. "You started something important, Thomas. You know that, right?" Thomas shrugged, but his eyes shone with pride. "I just did what I had to do." "Sometimes that's how the biggest changes start," Wilson replied. Later, as the event wound down, Wilson found himself helping stack chairs alongside Thomas's father. "Your captain called me yesterday," the father said casually. "Said the department wants to use our network as a model for other neighborhoods." Wilson nodded. "It's a good program. Fills a real need." He also mentioned something about a community liaison position they're creating. Said you'd be perfect for it. Wilson paused, chair in hand. He hadn't heard about this yet. Did he now? "Seems like that night changed things for all of us," the father reflected, "not just my family." As Wilson drove home that evening, he passed the spot where he'd pulled Thomas over all those months ago. He slowed down, remembering how close that moment had come to going very differently. One traffic stop, one choice to listen rather than just react, had sparked something bigger than himself. That night, he'd been the officer Thomas's family needed, not just the one they feared. And now, throughout the community, bridges were being built where walls had once stood. Wilson smiled to himself as he drove on. Sometimes, doing the right thing created ripples that turned into waves. Sometimes, the smallest moments made the biggest difference.